All right, good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock Pacific time, so we'll get started for today's webinar. So today, WestGrid has an invited speaker. Simon Goring will present some interesting work. So I met Simon over a decade ago when we were both grad students at Simon Fraser University. And since then, he's had lots of success and is building an amazing career. Now he's an associate scientist at the Department of Geography at the University of Wisconsin. His research has been cited over 1,000 times. He's affiliated with UBC. Is also affiliated with the NSF EarthCube organization. And that's an organization that is advancing cyber infrastructure development in the geosciences. And it's been doing that for over 10 years. And is also involved in data management for the Neotoma Paleoecology database. So Simon is a paleoecologist. I remember at SFU, he kept giving those really fantastic talks on ancient pollen, archaeological pollen. What's the technical term, Simon?
Yeah, fossil pollen. Sure.
Fossil pollen, there we go, fossil pollen. That was always very fascinating. And amongst very many other things, he's developed some packages for the R language and all sorts of really cool computing tools. But one tool that is really being involved into, and the tool is going to talk about today, is called Throughput. And I'll let Simon tell us about that.
Great. Thank you very much, Marie-Hélène. Welcome, everybody, to my talk. So I'm going to talk about this work that we've been doing for the past few years, myself and some collaborators as part of a funded project through EarthCube. And EarthCube, just briefly before I start getting into the slides, is an NSF, so it's funded by the National Sciences Foundation, and it's meant to be a joint program between advanced cyber infrastructure and the geosciences to try to bring the geosciences into the 21st century, to really build that cyber infrastructure backbone. And Throughput has come out of that, but in a lot of ways, I feel like it has developed beyond that, and we're ready to sort of mobilize the work that we've done into other disciplines. And so that's what I'm going to mostly focus on in this talk. So as Marie-Hélène said, my background is in paleoecology, studying past climate and ecosystem change over thousands of years. But through that process, I really became interested in data curation and data management, and in particular, thinking about data mobilization. So how do we take the data that we have generated and allow people not only to do to replicate our work, but to do new science with the data. And effectively, one of the things I've really been interested in is this idea of reducing time to science. So how do we take these data resources and give people the tools to do new science with them in a much faster way? So there's my Twitter handle. You're welcome to follow me, blah, blah, blah. This work obviously is not done on my own. I have a number of excellent collaborators. So Kirsten Leonard is at Columbia University at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, and she works with CESAR, which is the Earth sample system for Earth sample registration. Basically, the idea is they have been working to develop a system like DOIs, persistent identifiers for physical samples, and works with the EarthChem library as well. Nick McKay works with Linked Earth, which is a paleoclimate data repository. Steve Kuhn at Concord University has been working on a templating system to record critical metadata for volcanic ash events, both in the present and in the past. Some of you may be familiar with the web application mobile app Flyover Country, which is an application, you can follow the link, but it's basically an application that brings together multiple Earth science databases to a web-based application that you can use while you're flying in a plane and looking out over the countryside. You can see what's around you. Anders Noren is at the University of Minnesota and works with the Continental Drilling Office. And so they have physical archives of long drill cores that have been taken in lakes, large lakes, small lakes, whatever. So they are storing that physical data. Andrea Tomer is a researcher at the University of Michigan School of Information, and she looks at how people use data and scientific workflows. And then Socorro Dominguez is a graduate of the UBC Data Science Master's Program and is working with me at the University of Wisconsin, building workflows that use natural language processing to collect metadata from published papers. So a lot of the work that we've been doing sort of rests around this idea that research, that interdisciplinary research in particular, is complicated. We often, or researchers often have these grand ideas for bridging disciplines, but that task is often given then to master's students who maybe don't know how to find the appropriate data, don't know what all the appropriate methods are. And then they're still tasked with ensuring reproducibility and ultimately need to get credit for the work that they do. And each one of these steps along that chain poses challenges. And it's not just for interdisciplinary research. Ultimately, it's research as a whole that is complicated because we have all these things that we need to do. And as the computational needs of our work increase, it puts a lot of pressure on these individuals, especially because reproducibility and credit are very difficult when you're working with software in particular. So a lot of researchers who wind up, anyway, I won't get into that, but I hope you'll all agree with that. Software citation is difficult. It's, as a practice, it is not very well respected yet, although there are standards that are coming into play. At the same time, finding appropriate data and using the appropriate methods remain complicated as well. So we can dive into these elements a little bit, and we know that to find the appropriate data, you need to have some knowledge of existing disciplinary archives. So whether it's the Neotoma Paleoecology database, whether it's Oceans Network, whether it's DSpace, whatever the archive is, you need to have some knowledge about it, how it's structured, what the data objects in there actually represent. And once you get those, you then need to understand, how do I actually do this analysis? Is it something that I can just do qualitatively, or is it something that I need to use quantitative methods? What are the best practices in my field? And if we're doing interdisciplinary research, not only what are the best practices in that other field, but what do we need to do to bring together best practices that may, in fact, be in conflict with one another or with the data that we're getting from that other field? Once we apply these methods, how do we actually make these things reproducible? This is now a gold standard in a lot of analytic workflows. How do we make sure for a grad student, for a PhD student, that that work is reproducible and that we're following best practices? And finally, once we've done all this work, which is often quite significant, how do we then get credit for the new data sets that we've generated, these sort of synthetic data sets potentially? How do we get credit for that code repository that I've posted up in GitHub? And how, like, oftentimes the paper is less work than all the analysis that we do. And so how do we get credit for that? And I just want to sort of emphasize these first 2 points because that's a lot of what my talk is going to be on. These 4 points really sort of structured our thinking around Throughput in general, the Throughput project in general, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But I just want to point out that in particular, so finding appropriate data, even in the context of Throughput, where we've been looking at different data repositories, we've sent out emails. So Re3 Data is a service that is now aligned with DataCite. It's effectively a way to generate persistent identifiers for research databases. It collects metadata, it makes it accessible through an API, through a web-based portal. But in contacting research databases, at least 10% of them didn't have usable contact information. A number of them had web addresses that were no longer working. And so even when you know something about the resources, it's still not always easy to get the data. In addition, thinking about reproducibility and appropriate methods, a paper came out just last year that looked at Jupyter notebooks on GitHub and found that 73% of them were not reproducible if you just went to them and tried to run them. And I think this is really critical. We've been, a lot of people talk about Jupyter notebooks as the sort of gold standard, and yet we're still not doing the things we need to do to allow people to reproduce our work. So data resources play a very important role in this ecosystem of research. The database, and so here's an example from Neotoma. We wrote a paper a couple of years ago talking about the role of databases, community databases, because they link data stewards, data contributors, they link the people who access the data and educators to the sort of broader world of big data or cyber infrastructure. And they allow people to do lots of cool research. And so here's an example of some research using dung fungus. So fungal spores in lake sediment that come from the feces of mastodons. And basically, if you count up those spores in lake sediments, what you see is the process of general decline of megafauna at the end of the last ice age. And so this is really cool research that people can be doing, and potentially transformative research that that maybe wasn't initially thought of when people developed the databases. And these resources can play an important role in facilitating that, but often they don't have all the tools that they need. Those of you who manage or work with research databases may well know that it's difficult to maintain funding. It's difficult to do more than we already do as IT managers or as data managers. And so part of what we wanted to do in Throughput was pull some of this work off to the side and say, look, we can support you in some ways. And so some of these solutions for finding data, for finding best practices, for finding methods, we really felt like maybe we can build these graphs to think about this problem in general as a graph. And so Throughput ultimately is a graph database that provides that is an annotation graph. And so it provides a platform for data object annotation. So making comments on individual data objects, and I'll show an example of that in a little bit. A tool to discover connections, not just between a database and code repositories that use that data, but also between related databases in cases where people are doing a lot of interdisciplinary work between different databases. A system for managing non-authoritative metadata, and a tool to understand and track data and software citation. And so I'll show some examples of these things. But basically, Throughput is at its heart an implementation of the World Wide Web Consortium's annotation model. It basically allows people to have a target and create an annotation on that target, whether that target is a database itself, a data object, a code repository, another annotation. And we've extended this model then using well-defined and accepted vocabulary. So we've been working a lot with the Science in Schema team to implement schema.org vocabularies, DataCite, Crossref, the National Sciences Foundation. So we're not coming up with anything new, we're just putting together existing things. And basically with this tool, we then can add information to existing objects, and we can link together objects. So this is basically what is in Throughput. We use a Neo4j graph database. And so here we have an annotation. In this case, what we're doing is we're annotating a data object. So in this case, the object has its own data DOI. So using DataCite, the object is contained within a database. And then we can add annotations that may not be part of the original database metadata. So in this case, we might say like, okay, look, I did some analysis and it turned out that this data set is a statistical outlier when I do PCA or something like that. So it supplements information that we might have about the data object, but it doesn't really fit in the traditional fields either of the data set itself or in the DataCite metadata. Annotations are really nice because they're super flexible. We can, the annotation model itself is pretty broad. We've implemented it, I think, in a pretty smart way. I like to think about it's a smart way. And so we can add text annotations to a data object. We can add subject and keywords as annotations. We can link different databases or repositories. We can add down here our synonyms. So we can start building up a broader knowledge graph that eventually builds this network. And so within Throughput itself, there's over 300,000 annotations, which leads to about 43 million different object connections. We have almost 500,000 scientific grants registered. We have full text articles linked as well with their DOIs. We've indexed about 2,500 databases, research databases, and 74,000 code repositories. So this is a relatively large knowledge graph that we now have, and we have information not only about the objects themselves, but also about the connections between them and the kinds of connections. And so here's just an example of different code repositories and the connections that they have just among their keywords. And so you can see here's Ocean Networks Canada and some of the keywords that are used to describe it, and then connections between other repositories that share those keywords. So how do we actually then make use of this graph? So one of the things we did was we started out by building this using metadata from re3data and DataCite. And then we can link that information to information that we can scrape from GitHub and Crossref. And so the idea is, let's take some of this information that we can get from these data providers and then try to find links to that information in things like GitHub and Crossref, which would be examples of data use or reuse. And so one of the ways we can do that is one of the things we started doing was using information from our OpenSci, but we are also using full text search in GitHub and basically finding examples of data use. So we happen to know that the R library Neotoma uses data or accesses data from the Neotoma paleoecology database. And so we can add this into the graph. In addition, we can use geoDeep Dive. This is another EarthCube funded project, NSF funded project based out of the University of Wisconsin. There are 13 million full text documents in there. They've been processed using the Stanford natural language processing library and some other tools as well. And we have been doing full text, regular expression, and NLP model searching within these documents to find things like references to external DOIs, references to GitHub repositories to look for informal software citation, and a bunch of other things that we can talk about if you want to later. But basically what this allows us to do is then add information from legacy publications, publications that haven't necessarily been indexed with DataCite or referenced by existing data resources to improve recall of data within the scientific knowledge graph. And so we might get, so basically we get these kinds of annotations, which would show that some database here that is of a type schema data catalog is linked to my Simon Goring cool repository that is a code repository. And so as we start building these up, we basically we are able to access information from Re3 data to get some metadata about the database. And we can get some information from GitHub using their API to increase our knowledge about the nature of this link and just to link this and make it accessible. We've really tried to use external APIs and persistent identifiers within our graph. So for example, the provenance information within the graph uses ORCIDs as well. And so we can sort of build more information without the database, without Throughput itself having to actually store a lot of this data. We're able to farm that out to the people who are experts in managing information about people, or the experts about managing information about code repositories or databases. This link here that I showed is between a database and a code repository, but we also, we have a set of types that are defined by schema.org or by Dublin Core, other kinds of resources. And so we have information about links between different objects like grants and journal articles, data sets and grants. We can have text annotations as well. And so this model that we started with, really to link databases and GitHub repositories, is actually very flexible and has allowed us to do a lot more. So here is an example of a simple graph that's just showing sets of research databases and then GitHub repositories that link them. This is within the earth sciences. This is a small subset of links within the earth sciences. One of the challenges that's posed by doing research across multiple databases is that the metadata standards are often very different. And so when we think about big data and the 4 V's of big data, velocity, volume, veracity, variety is often one of the 4th V in this case, is often one of the most challenging V's to account for, because you have to do this whole process of alignment between what one field thinks it is and what another database field thinks it is. That was a terrible explanation, but I hope you understand that basically just because I talk about temperature in one database doesn't mean that the temperature this other database is talking about is the same thing. And this can be very challenging. And so we can use information in these data repositories that have done the linking between 2 databases to actually try to figure out, how are people doing this alignment? What are best practices for this alignment? And what are potentially emerging behaviors in research that we can take account for when we're writing our next grant as a database manager, or when we're trying to figure out how best to serve the community that's using our data. So this tool is potentially useful just from a knowledge perspective. What are people actually doing? It's also a good tool just for data discovery. How we have information about these individual databases, and so what, we can do basic searches. I'll show you that in a second. From a data manager perspective, it's important to understand how people are actually using your data. And from the perspective of myself, who works as one of the lead IT people with Neotoma, we often don't know how people are using our data until we see it in publication. And sometimes we don't even see those publications because of the way people reference data. So it's important to be able to use a tool like this to track data use and understand best practices and emerging practices in data use and reuse. The other thing that's really nice and that we've been able to do is because tools like geoDeep Dive have been using, so the geoDeep Dive has contracts with publishers like Wiley and Taylor and Francis and Elsevier that go back through the entire history of individual journals. We can actually go in and start doing some searches for things like DOIs or references to, online software that's posted at URLs. And we can actually make some of these links that can then subsequently go into data site metadata or cross-ref metadata. So we're sort of doing work for people that can get leveraged eventually. So this finally gets us, maybe I should have rearranged my slides a little bit. This does get us then to the tool itself. And so there is this is at throughputdb.com. I'm going to just stop my slides for a second and pop in. And so the Throughput website is pretty basic. I have been doing a lot of this work myself. It's coded with Vue.js. We use Node and Express APIs to serve the data from the database. But basically, when you get to it, you can search either by keyword or by text. And so I can go and just type in Neotoma. Oh, sorry, that's a text search. And I'll submit my search. And we then see, okay, here's a link to the Neotoma paleoecology database. I can go to that database, but I can also see the code repositories that are linked to that database. And so if I click on this code repositories tab, I can see here are some course materials that reference Neotoma. Here are some GitHub repositories that do some different stuff. So actually, here's the API for Neotoma. Here's the Throughput API that references the Neotoma paleoecology database. And so I can go through these and try to find, these are examples of use, and maybe these can act as templates for work that I want to do subsequently. I can also search for keywords. And so one of the things I can do here is do my keyword search. Do my keyword search, and I can maybe say, okay, I'm an undergraduate and I have a research project where I need to combine climate data and soils data. Oh, how did that not add? There we go. And so I can submit my search, and I will see here that here is a data discovery, but here's a database that uses both climate and soils. And so maybe this is something that I want to look at. I'm able to select a subset of these databases. And so maybe I feel like this one's not interesting. Maybe EOL isn't something I want. This one, if you look at it, doesn't have any matching code repositories. So I'm actually going to remove that. And I'm just going to click through a bunch of these. And then I can look at the code repositories. And so here I get a sense of what the code repositories are and which databases we have links to. Now, and so this is a tool that people can use. One of the things you'll notice, and I'll talk about this in a minute, is that some of these, like this Peter MR Climate, if you were to click through this, it's just a collection of open access papers. So it's plain text that in some of these articles happens to reference the Globe database, Data One, or the Bolin Center database. So this isn't potentially useful if you're looking for reproducible workflows, but it may be useful for other reasons. And so I'm just going to hop back here. Am I going to go to, there we go. Okay, so we do have this portal now. We can go in there. We can collect information about the different GitHub repositories. But there are a number of challenges in terms of trying to build these links. So one, we have to do full text searches in GitHub to try to find these links right now. There is a tool that we are working on that would allow you to use ORCID authentication and have people add in links themselves. And we have been soliciting different data repositories as well to say, hey, do you know of any GitHub repositories that might be of interest? But at the same time, we have encouraged people, at least within EarthCube, to start using standard, some standard formatting within their README files for GitHub repositories. So badges that indicate, the grants that are being funded, badges for individuals' ORCIDs, things like that, to sort of have a standard machine readable elements within these README files that can be discoverable. We are still challenged because people don't use proper software citations or source data. So even with data set DOIs, people are not always citing them. For the scraping from geoDeep dive, some of that from legacy publications comes from optical character recognition. The full text comes from optical character recognition. And this presents problems as well because elements, the letter O sometimes looks like a Q. And then again, along with the README files, there's often a lack of standards for Jupyter and R Markdown documents. So a person may say that this was written by so-and-so, but they do it in a bunch of different ways, and that makes it really difficult. Or they import packages in a bunch of different ways. And so it makes it hard to go through and try to scrape this information in a usable way. And then the challenges in code discovery. I said repository variety, and I can't remember. Oh, yeah, right. Okay, right. So repository variety is also a huge challenge. And so like I showed you, people use their code repositories for a bunch of different reasons. And there is not, so there are some typologies that we can use for software, but there isn't really an existing typology for code repository use. And so with Andrea Tomer and Morgan Wofford, who both I think came out of Christine Borgman's lab, who you may or may not know, we've been working with them. We've been working on this typology for GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab's repositories. So what are people actually using these for? Part of the reason we want to do this is in an effort to improve the search results that we're actually returning with our search tool. And so is the GitHub repository educational? Is it like class notes? Does it present analysis? So some sort of workflow to produce a set of graphs or a set of statistical results. Is this a software tool? Is it an API or some other computational interface? Is it just storage? And then we have a set of other repository types. So scraping databases, scraping repositories. So there's a lot that are just like Wikipedia, scraped Wikipedia stuff. Are they articles? Are they informational links? So like someone's home web page. And then obviously 404 issues, stuff like that. So we have been going through a bunch of these repositories, trying to start classifying them, and then building a machine learning classification and tagging algorithm to basically be able to take the information about the repositories as we find them and start trying to classify them so that when you do a search, you could filter by only informational repositories or only analytic repository. And so basically that would look something like this, where we would have some extra badges along the side here to try and give people additional context. So Throughput has a lot of moving parts. We have this code cookbook tool where we're presenting people with some of this information about the GitHub repositories that they're finding. One of the other tools that we're building is this end user annotation widget. So for example, on your landing page for a data set that's identified with a DOI potentially, if someone knows some additional information about that, they would be able to either click and add a text annotation or see other annotations that people had made. And so one of the examples that I gave was this idea of, this data set. It's a really interesting data set, but when you do some sort of statistical analysis with it, it winds up being an outlier for whatever reason. And that's useful information to pass on. That's social information about data that can be very valuable, but oftentimes doesn't fit in with the metadata standards for an individual database. And so what we're doing is we're linking that to ORCID as well, so that there's some sort of trust given to the person, or some sort of trust element built into the system, so that a random person just isn't tagging things. And because these annotations are searchable through the API or through our API, data managers can also look at these annotations and say, are these things that we want to implement in our data model, or are they things that we can resolve ourselves? We are currently trying to characterize patterns of data use and reuse, particularly in the geosciences, although we have this information more broadly across disciplines. It's a really interesting, because, we have these reports or papers that are coming out that are linking. So in this case, I don't know if I say it somewhere here, but so this report on volcanic eruptions uses data from 13 different databases. And so we're really interested, okay, how are they actually linking up the information from these databases? Are they using them on their own, or are they doing synthesis to try to bring together more information? What is the process by which they are connecting fields across different databases? And as we look at those, can we find ways of building better tools to do this kind of connection? We are working on feature extraction and metadata generation from publications, and in conjunction with this data repository recommendation system. So basically, and so there's a link to a GitHub repository that Socorro has been working on, but basically going back to journal publications, doing some machine learning prediction from regular expression tagging, and basically saying, given a database's metadata structure or a data structure, can we find information in these publications to build metadata stubs for eventual acquisition by that database? And that's a more complicated problem, but it's a really cool problem, and we're making some pretty interesting advances there. And then finally, we're really working on integrating legacy and informal knowledge into the research data graph. And so there's a lot of stuff that people like Force 11 is doing to advance citation practices, to push people like DataCite and Crossref to include broader sets of related identifiers within their data fields. But there's this huge body of literature that remains unacquired and unlinked. And so we're using a lot of our full text search tools to actually start to try to bring these in. We're not necessarily pushing Crossref or Neotoma or Linked Earth Data or EarthChem to directly ingest this data. What we're doing is we're saying, look, we have these tools. Here's the workflows that we've done. This is the stuff that does link to your data. We want to make that accessible to you. And if you want to incorporate it, that's great. If not, you can link to us, or this is just available to you. So that's it. I feel like that was a a pretty abrupt end to my talk. And so maybe the better end is, there's lots that I brought up. And maybe the better end is to take some questions now and talk about things with you all.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. So if anyone has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and to ask away at Simon. And I actually have a bit of a cynical comment or question. Yeah. I was listening to you that now with data sets that are so easy to access, isn't there maybe in a very cynical world a risk that people could be fishing for the data sets that actually give them the results that they want and to exclude data sets that might not be working for them? And so I'm wondering, if data sets become so easily available, shouldn't there be some best practices set in place, kind of like when you do a literature review to show which data sets you've included, which you have excluded, and to justify why you have excluded such and such data sets?
Right. I mean, so I don't think that that's a new problem. I think if we look at what people were talking, so Andrew Gelman, often who's a statistician at Columbia University, often talks about researcher degrees of freedom, where people will often do these broad longitudinal studies and then just keep doing like paired t-tests until they find something significant. I mean, Bonferroni correction happens for a reason, right? And
no, of course, but it just makes it that much easier if you have these maps of all these data sets, and you can as you said, it's easy to see the outliers and stuff, and so maybe it just makes that fishing work that much easier for people who even unconsciously are driven by results they're looking after. And it can be an unconscious process.
So, I mean, I think that there's a lot of, there's a lot of work that's going on already about like research, study, pre-registration and stuff. I think one of the...
Pre-registration would be a good fix. Yeah, good point.
And I'm trying to think of where I just saw this, but, oh, right. So when I was talking about the 4 V's of big data, and sometimes people talk about the 5 V's, sometimes people talk about the 7 V's. I saw something that was like the 43 V's the other day, and I was like, oh my God.
That's a lot of V's. I don't think I know 40 words that start with V.
But one of them is validity. And oftentimes when we talk about validity, we talk about things like issues with citizen science and stuff like that. But one of the things that that was brought up, and this was in the context of like equity research with big data. And I'm sorry, I don't remember who said it, but it was super interesting, was this idea that oftentimes our data sets may be biased just because of the way that we've collected them in the first place, or because of the background that we have going into this analysis. And so one of the nice things about building this broader web and being able to look across databases, for example, is that we can discover data sets that maybe fill those holes as well. So my hope...
Oh, that's a great argument to my very cynical comment. You're right. It can also actually solve some of the problems in databases that were biased to start with. No, that's a great point.
And it's still, I mean, I think we can be cynical about anything. I think that the hope is that, like, because we allow both this retrospective tool where we can go back and look at publications and try to do that, some of that matching, like, yes, they use this database, potentially we can support people to fill those holes where people have done that kind of cynical work.
Cool. Are there other questions from the audience? Don't be shy. You can ask in the chat if you don't have a microphone, or you can just unmute yourself. And maybe, Simon, if you want to share in the chat either your Twitter handle or an email address or some way to be reached if someone would like to ask you a question like without putting themselves out there, you know, like,
absolutely. And so I will,
shy, subdued.
There was one last slide, and so I'll just share that. So I will say one of the things that we've really tried to do is be conscious in our, you know, in our openness. And so everything that we've done is licensed under an MIT license. There are database snapshots. Oh yeah, so there are database snapshots. So this is a graph database. The information is both on that Throughput DB, which I'll put in the chat, that throughputdb.com. Oh no, sorry, it's not there, but I'll post it in the chat. So there is an explanation of exactly how to get this database set up on your own instance, wherever you want. We have a lot of our deep dive work uses Docker and Jupyter notebooks. It should be pretty much entirely reproducible. And then we have this REST API as well to access the data. And certainly there is a code of conduct associated with the, I can't stop screen sharing because of where the button is. Would you be able to stop me from screen sharing?
Oh yes, yes, that happens to me on the new Zoom. So Alex, could you?
Okay, it's fine. I think.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Okay,
I have this problem too.
I don't know what it is. It's super frustrating. So, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a Zoom bug on some OS.
So there's some documentation there as well that can walk you through like installing this on your own local device. So, and so, yeah, we're very happy to talk with people and work with people if they're interested in the data at all. And we're very happy to credit people with their contributions.